Story 1. The Disappearing Car. It was a quiet, rainy evening, the kind where the world feels like it's been softened by the gentle drizzle. The only sound was the steady patter of rain against the windshield of a woman's car as she made her way home. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the dark, empty night. She had just finished a long day, and the loneliness of the road echoed her fatigue. The streets were eerily quiet, almost deserted. The occasional car passed her in the opposite direction, but the night felt like a separate world, distant from everything she knew. It was well past midnight, the hour when even the city itself seems to sleep, but she still had a good way to go before she reached home. Her headlights cut through the misty rain, casting long beams of light onto the slick, wet pavement. The road was straight and narrow, bordered by thick trees, and the occasional house far off in the distance. As she drove, the rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the car was oddly comforting. But that sense of calm was shattered by something strange. Ahead of her, she noticed a car. It wasn't unusual. There were a few vehicles out on the road, though they were few and far between. She had been following this particular car for miles now. It was an older sedan, one of those models that seemed to belong to the past. Not quite vintage, but old enough to have a certain charm. It was a deep shade of blue, almost black, with rain droplets clinging to its surface, and its headlights glowed softly through the mist. The woman had been behind the car for what felt like ages, their speeds matching in a perfect unspoken rhythm. She barely even thought about the car anymore, just focused on the steady motion of the road beneath her wheels. But then, something impossible happened. In a blink, the car ahead of her, the one she had been following for so long, vanished. It wasn't that it turned off onto a side street or slowed down and merged with another lane. No, this was different. One moment, she was following it, watching its brake lights glowing softly in front of her, and the next, it was simply gone. No trace, no sound, no sign of it anywhere. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced around in a flurry, scanning the road, the trees, the distant houses, but the car was nowhere to be found. She quickly checked her rearview mirror, her breath hitching in her throat, but again, nothing. There was no trace of the car, no shadow in the mist, no reflection in the rain-soaked pavement. She was alone on the road now, with no other vehicles in sight. How could a car just disappear like that? She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe she had lost focus for a moment, but that didn't explain the sudden absence. Her mind raced. Could she have passed it without realizing? No, she would have seen it. The road ahead was clear, the streetlights casting long shadows that made every object in sight visible. But that car, it was just gone. It was as though it had evaporated into thin air. For a long moment, she stared at the empty road in front of her, the mist swirling around her car like some kind of living thing. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind working overtime to explain what had happened. Could it have been an illusion? A trick of the light? A trick of her tired mind, perhaps? She didn't believe in such things, not in ghosts, not in supernatural occurrences, but this didn't feel like just a lapse in concentration. It felt wrong, like something had happened to the very fabric of time itself. She could still remember every detail about the car, the deep blue color, the weathered bumpers, the small dent on the rear fender, the license plate. She could even recall the numbers, something she hadn't paid close attention to when she first noticed the car. And yet, even as she remembered those details, it was as if the car had never been there at all. The more she thought about it, the more the memory of it seemed to fade, as if it were a dream slipping away in the early morning light. But how could it just disappear? How could something so solid, so real, vanish in the blink of an eye? She glanced at the road again, her mind still reeling from the strange event. She slowed her car, letting it coast for a while, trying to calm herself down. The rain continued to fall steadily, tapping against her windshield. But now, instead of offering comfort, it felt almost ominous. The night seemed to stretch on, endless and heavy, pressing in on her. As she passed a familiar stretch of road, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air seemed different, colder, and for a moment, she almost wondered if she had somehow entered a different world. Her eyes scanned the road one more time, hoping to see something, anything, that might explain the strange event. But the road remained empty. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time itself felt like it had stopped. She wasn't sure how long it had been, but when she finally reached her destination, she pulled into the driveway of her home with a sense of relief. The rain had begun to let up, but the fog remained, thick and suffocating. She turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, staring out through the windshield. It was then that she realized something even stranger. As she sat there, trying to make sense of the strange events, she realized she couldn't remember exactly when the car had vanished. It was as if the entire incident had existed in a place outside of time, a place where seconds stretched, where moments didn't belong. The more she thought about it, the more disconnected from reality the experience felt. It was as if she had witnessed something she couldn't explain, a shift in the fabric of the universe itself. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, shaking the thought from her mind. It was just a strange moment, she told herself. Just one of those oddities that life throws your way. A glitch, if you will. But even as she walked toward her door, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been part of something much bigger. Something that defied every rule of logic and reason. And as she lay down to sleep that night, the thought still lingered in the back of her mind. What if, in that moment, time had bent? What if reality had been stretched in a way she couldn't understand? What if the car had never really been there at all? The mystery of that disappearing car would stay with her, haunting her thoughts as she drifted off to sleep. And somewhere, in the quiet folds of the night, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had experienced a glitch in the matrix, a reminder that, sometimes, reality is much stranger than we could ever imagine. Story 2. The Clock That Stopped Time. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the air felt cool and fresh, and the gentle light of the early hours filtered softly through the curtains. The house was still, and the only sound was the steady ticking of the clocks on the walls. Each one, scattered throughout the rooms, marked the passing of time in perfect harmony. The second hands moved with their usual precision, ticking steadily, one after the other. It was a rhythm as familiar as breathing, constant, reliable, and reassuring. But then, in the middle of this calm, something unexplainable happened. The woman was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee, watching the steam rise from the mug as she slowly woke up to the new day. She glanced up at the clock on the wall across from her. its second hand moving with its usual steady precision. She had been awake for only a few minutes, but something felt different. She couldn't quite place it, but it was as if the house was holding its breath. It was so quiet, the world so still, that even the ticking of the clocks seemed louder than usual. And then, without any warning, it happened. The second hand on the clock in front of her simply stopped. Just like that. One moment, it was moving, ticking forward, marking the seconds. And the next, it froze. It didn't slow down. It didn't tick backward. It just halted. Her mind tried to process it. Maybe it's broken, just a malfunction, she thought. She stood up and walked over to the clock, staring at the still second hand, her brow furrowed. She reached out to tap the glass, thinking it might jolt it back into movement, but the hand remained unmoving, frozen in place. She checked the time, and it was exactly 8:15 in the morning. The hands on the clock, both minute and hour, were stuck in the same position. At first, she thought maybe it was just a fluke. A clock breaking down isn't so unusual, right? But then, she turned her gaze to the other clocks in the room, the ones on the mantel and the one above the kitchen sink, ticking away as they always did. But when she looked closer, her stomach dropped. All of them had stopped at the exact same moment. She walked slowly around the house, glancing at every clock. The grandfather clock in the living room, the small clock on her nightstand, the digital clock on the microwave, all of them frozen at exactly 8:15. Time had come to a complete and inexplicable halt. She checked her phone, hoping for some reassurance. But when she glanced at the screen, the time there was also frozen. Everything around her, all the clocks, all the devices, had come to a sudden stop. The stillness in the air was palpable. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She could feel it, a strange unease that crept in like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't just the clocks. It felt like time itself had paused, like it had taken a break from its usual march forward. She tried to reset the clocks, but every time she adjusted the time, they simply refused to move. It was as if the clocks themselves had become trapped, locked in a moment of eternity. She moved from room to room, tugging at clock hands, pressing buttons, and tapping on the faces of the digital screens, but nothing worked. It was as though the very act of moving time forward was no longer possible. The minutes stretched, but nothing changed. There was no ticking, no second hand moving, no movement at all. It was so quiet now, too quiet. The world outside her window seemed muffled, as if it were distant, like a dream she couldn't quite reach. She stood still for a while, staring at the clocks, trying to make sense of it. She glanced at her phone again, and this time, it showed the same frozen time. The house felt frozen. The air was thick with something unnameable. Her breath was slow, her thoughts heavy. She couldn't help but wonder, was this it? Was time broken? Minutes passed, or maybe they didn't. She had no way of knowing. The feeling of the house, of the world around her, was different. It felt like she was inside a bubble, removed from the flow of time, as if the universe had just paused for her, a personal glitch in the timeline, a moment where time itself had taken a break. And just as suddenly as it had stopped, it all changed. A soft ticking sound, distant at first, began to fill the air again. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. But then, slowly, the clocks began to move once more. The second hand on the kitchen clock, which had been frozen for so long, finally twitched. And then it started to move again, steady, ticking forward as if nothing had ever happened. The moment was so strange, so surreal, that it almost felt like the world was waking up from a deep sleep. The clocks, which had once been trapped in an endless moment, were now ticking forward as though time itself had resumed. The house, the world outside her window, everything, it all seemed to fall back into place. But even though the clocks were moving again, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted, ever so slightly, in the fabric of time. She glanced at the wall clock once more, watching the second hand tick steadily. But deep down, she knew that something had happened. Time had stopped. And then it had started again, as if nothing had happened. It was as though the universe had pressed pause and then hit play. She sat down at the kitchen table, still trying to make sense of what she had just experienced. Had it been real? Or was it just a figment of her tired mind, a trick of the senses? Was it a malfunction of the clocks? Or was something more mysterious at work? Something that defied the rules of reality itself? Was she just imagining it? Or had there truly been a glitch in the timeline? She didn't know. And maybe she thought that was the most unsettling part of all. As the day went on, she went about her routine, the clocks ticking away as they always had. But every so often, when she glanced at them, she would pause, just for a moment, and wonder, what if time had actually stopped? And as she lay down to sleep that night, the thought lingered, weaving through her dreams. Was there something hidden beneath the surface of reality? A place where time could break, where the clocks could freeze, and where the very nature of existence could be interrupted? She didn't know. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but feel that just for a brief moment, she had glimpsed something beyond the ordinary, a glimpse of a world where time was not as fixed as it seemed, where it could slip away, pause, and then start again, without a single second lost. Story 3. The Repeating Conversation. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those peaceful moments when time seemed to move a little slower. You and your friend were sitting on the couch, enjoying each other's company. You'd been chatting for a while about all sorts of things, from the latest TV show you both were watching, to trivial matters about the day's events. It was the kind of conversation that didn't need to be important, just lighthearted chatter, the kind that filled the quiet spaces of everyday life. You had both been talking about a TV show you had recently started watching together. You remembered laughing about the ridiculous plot twists and the quirky characters. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just a casual back and forth between friends. You smiled, feeling comfortable, knowing that the conversation was heading down the familiar path of comfortable banter. But then, something strange happened. As your friend spoke, reciting a line they had just said a moment ago about the show, you froze. It was the exact same words, the exact same phrasing. You blinked in confusion. It wasn't just that the words seemed familiar. They were the same, exactly the same, as if your friend had said it twice, back to back, in perfect repetition. At first, you thought maybe you hadn't been paying attention, that it was just your mind playing tricks on you. But the moment passed, and you tried to shake it off. Maybe I just misheard them, you thought. You tried to focus, nodding along and continuing the conversation. You changed the topic, talking about something else, something completely unrelated to the TV show, perhaps a recent outing or a funny story from your past. But then, without warning, it happened again. Your friend repeated the same thing they had just said, word for word. The same tone, the same smile, the same rhythm of their speech. You could feel your heartbeat quicken in your chest as you stared at them, wondering if they were messing with you. Surely this wasn't happening. Could they be repeating themselves on purpose? But no, you didn't think they were playing a joke. You saw the confusion in their eyes, the same surprise you felt mirrored in their face. They looked just as confused as you did. They hadn't meant to repeat the words, but somehow they had. You felt an unsettling chill creep over you as you tried to wrap your mind around it. You brushed it off again, telling yourself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was distracted for a second, you reasoned, trying to make sense of it. So you continued talking, pushing the bizarre feeling aside as best as you could. This time, you made sure to change the subject, a totally different topic. You asked about something that had been on your mind lately, a new hobby, or a recent event in your life. Something fresh, something unrelated to the conversation you had just been having. But it happened again. The same conversation, the same words, the same topic. Your friend looked at you, their face a mix of confusion and concern. Had I said that already? They asked, a bewildered expression on their face. You couldn't even begin to explain what was happening. This time, it felt almost like déjà vu, but not the usual kind. It was deeper. It was as if time itself had decided to repeat a single moment, over and over, as though you were stuck in a loop. You tried to change the subject once more, but each time you spoke, the conversation circled back. It was as though no matter what you said, you couldn't escape it. It was as if reality itself was locked in a loop, pulling you back into the same words, the same phrases, over and over again. The more you tried to change it, the more the conversation kept repeating itself, until it felt like the walls of the room had disappeared, and you were caught in a space where time itself had stopped, frozen in the same moment. There was no escape from the repetition. The words came out of your mouth, your friend's mouth, in perfect synchronization, without deviation. It wasn't like a normal conversation anymore. You couldn't break free. The conversation didn't feel real anymore. It felt scripted, as if the universe itself had become stuck in a strange, impossible loop, and you were its unwilling participant. The room felt different now, as if the air had thickened, making it harder to breathe. Every time you tried to focus on something else, to look away, you were drawn back into the same words. I know we're talking about this, but it feels wrong, you thought. The sensation was chilling, like you were trapped in a moment that was both the present and the past. A moment that refused to move forward. It was disorienting. It was maddening. You glanced at your friend once more. Their face was filled with confusion, but also perhaps a hint of fear. Were they feeling it too? Were they stuck in this strange loop, just as you were? You couldn't tell. Their face seemed to reflect the exact same disbelief that you felt inside. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the conversation stopped repeating. Time seemed to snap back into place, as if someone had lifted the weight off the room. You both looked at each other in silence for a moment. The air felt lighter, the oppressive heaviness lifting. You weren't sure whether to laugh or cry. What had just happened? Was it real? Had it been some kind of shared hallucination, a trick of the mind? Or had time itself somehow fractured, creating this impossible loop for just the two of you? Your heart still raced, but slowly, you felt the tension in your chest ease. You took a deep breath, trying to return to the normal rhythm of conversation. But the strangeness lingered, hanging in the back of your mind like a whisper you couldn't quite shake off. As you both resumed talking, the world seemed to go back to normal. But in the quiet corners of your mind, a thought remained. What if time isn't as linear as we think? What if, sometimes, it loops, repeating moments we can't see or understand, trapping us in a place where nothing seems to change, even though everything should? And as you drifted off to sleep that night, you couldn't help but wonder, could time really loop like that? Could you ever notice it again? Or would it pass by unnoticed, slipping through the cracks of reality? Perhaps the next time you have a conversation, you'll pause, just for a second, and wonder, is this the moment where the loop begins again? Story 4. The Vanishing Stranger. It was a late evening when the man found himself walking down an unfamiliar street. The city around him seemed to have taken on a strange, almost dreamlike quality. The usual hum of traffic had faded, and the air was thick with the scent of rain that had long since passed. He had been walking for some time, trying to find his way to a part of town he wasn't familiar with. The streets were quieter now, and he wasn't exactly sure where he was. His phone had died earlier, and he didn't want to ask anyone for directions. A sense of curiosity, mixed with a hint of unease, had drawn him deeper into the city. He came upon an alleyway, narrow and shadowed, tucked between two old buildings. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting odd shadows along the walls. The alley wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find during a peaceful evening stroll, but something about it called to him. The air was heavier here, cooler, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Despite the unease creeping along his spine, he decided to walk down it. The alley was quiet, save for the distant noise from the main street. As he moved deeper into the darkness, his footsteps seemed to grow louder against the stillness. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, but the alleyway stretched on much longer than he had expected, the walls of the buildings on either side closing in around him. The passageway felt strangely familiar and foreign at the same time. There was a sense that he had been here before, though he knew he hadn't. As he walked further, the sound of someone approaching grew louder, and he looked up to see a figure coming toward him. The person was a man, dressed in an old coat, his face partially obscured by the collar. His expression was strange, unsettling even. The man's eyes were dark and unreadable, and his presence felt wrong somehow. As they drew closer, the stranger stopped just a few feet in front of him. The man tried to smile, but it came off as more of a grimace. There was an unnatural stillness about him, as if he wasn't quite part of this world. The strange man looked at the man with a gaze that felt almost too intense, too knowing. Then, without any warning, the stranger spoke. "You don't belong here. Go back." The words were simple, yet they hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The man stood frozen, unsure of what to make of this sudden encounter. The words seemed too direct, too chilling, as though they carried a weight that he couldn't understand. Before he could respond, the stranger turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows of the alley. The man stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't been prepared for this. The words echoed in his mind, but before he could process them further, something even stranger happened. He turned around to leave the alley, but when he did, something was wrong. The alleyway was no longer there. He stopped in his tracks, blinking in disbelief. The narrow, dimly lit passage he had been walking through was gone, replaced by something entirely different. Where once there had been walls and shadows, there was now a wide open space. The alley had disappeared completely, as if it had never existed at all. He found himself standing in the middle of a busy square, bustling with people who seemed completely oblivious to his confusion. The air was filled with the murmur of voices, the sound of footsteps, the rustling of newspapers, and the distant hum of city life. It was as if the alleyway had been erased from existence, and in its place, a busy plaza had taken its place. There were people walking by, some hurrying to their destinations, others casually chatting as they passed. It was as though he had stepped into an entirely different scene, a different reality. The man turned around, searching for any sign of the alley that had been there just moments ago. But there was nothing. The place where it should have been was just empty space, open and wide, filled with the rush of people and the vibrant noise of a city square. His breath quickened. Had he just imagined the alley? Had it been a trick of the mind, a brief moment of disorientation? But no, he could still see the dark corners of it in his memory, feel the chill of the shadows, hear the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the narrow space. He could remember being there, and yet now it was gone, replaced by something so normal, so real. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a mistake? Maybe he had taken a wrong turn, walked into a part of town that didn't exist anymore. He looked around again, hoping for some sort of sign. But no, everything here seemed too real, too ordinary. The people walking by didn't notice him. No one seemed to care that he had just appeared out of nowhere in the middle of their crowded square. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. Had I crossed over into some other version of reality? He wondered. Was the alley really just an illusion? The idea seemed impossible, but nothing about what he was experiencing felt entirely possible either. The stranger's words still echoed in his mind. "You don't belong here. Go back." Was that a warning? A message that he had somehow stepped into a place where he didn't belong? Feeling a sudden sense of unease, he decided to leave the square and walk back in the direction he had come from, hoping to find some familiar landmarks to anchor him in reality. But as he walked, everything around him seemed slightly off, too sharp, too detailed, like the edges of reality were a little too crisp, the colors a little too vibrant. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in the same world he had been in just moments ago. With every step, he felt the weight of the strange encounter weighing on him more. He had crossed into something unfamiliar, something that didn't make sense, and now he wasn't sure how to get back. Had he stepped into a different version of the city, a parallel universe? Or had he just lost himself in a trick of the mind, in the spaces between sleep and wakefulness? He didn't know, but the uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him with the uncomfortable feeling that he was standing on the edge of something vast, something he could never understand. As he walked through the busy square, The faces of strangers passing by all seemed indifferent to his confusion. The stranger's warning echoed louder in his mind. "You don't belong here." What did it mean? Was he still the same person, standing in the same city he had known all his life? Or had he crossed some invisible boundary, a thin veil that separated one reality from another? When he finally returned to the edge of the square, he took a deep breath and looked back, hoping to see some sign of the alley that had vanished. But there was nothing. Only the ordinary world remained bustling with life, as though nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Story 5. The Parallel Dream. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when the woman awoke. The sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the walls. The clock on her nightstand ticked quietly, marking the beginning of a new day. The air in the room was cool, and the stillness of the morning wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. She stretched lazily, yawning as she took in the quiet rhythm of the house. It was the kind of morning that felt familiar, the kind where everything was just as it should be. She climbed out of bed and made her way to the bathroom, her bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. Her mind was still foggy from sleep, but there was a sense of comfort in the routine. She washed her face, brushed her teeth, and then walked toward the kitchen to begin her day. It was all so normal, so much so that she hadn't yet noticed the oddity creeping in. As she entered the kitchen, she took a deep breath. The scent of coffee wafted through the air, and the sound of the kettle quietly bubbling filled the room. She paused for a moment to take it all in. The warmth, the calmness, the routine that she had come to know so well. But then, she glanced at the counter, and her eyes locked onto the cup she always used, sitting there beside the toaster. At first, it seemed completely normal. It was just like every other morning. But as she looked closer, she noticed something strange. The mug wasn't the one she usually used. The color was different, a deep shade of green instead of the usual blue. She frowned, feeling a ripple of confusion. "That's odd," she thought. "I always use the blue mug." She didn't dwell on it, though. Maybe she had simply forgotten which one she used last night. It wasn't a big deal. Her eyes shifted toward the counter again, where a slice of bread sat, waiting to be toasted. But something was off about the bread. She stepped closer to the counter, her heart suddenly picking up its pace. This wasn't the brand she normally bought. The bread was a different shape, a different texture, and the label was unfamiliar. She touched it, feeling the cool surface of the loaf beneath her fingers. It was real, but it didn't belong in her kitchen. A strange sensation began to rise within her. Her mind raced as she tried to explain the oddness of what she was seeing. Was this a dream? She wondered. Could I have just woken up and not even realized I'm still dreaming? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. But they kept coming back, growing stronger. She walked over to the window, hoping a glimpse of the outside world would ground her. Maybe it would help her understand what was happening. But the moment she looked outside, the feeling in her chest tightened. The weather was all wrong. It wasn't the crisp morning air she was used to, the soft golden light of the sun peeking through the trees. No, outside the sky was a strange shade of gray, and the clouds looked heavier than usual, like a storm was brewing. The trees outside her window swayed more violently than they should have, and the streets, which were normally quiet at this time of morning, were bustling with activity. It was then that she realized, this is not my world. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she turned to take in the rest of the kitchen. The same counter, the same cabinets, the same table, but nothing felt quite right. The smallest details had shifted, just slightly, but enough to make everything feel off. The clock on the wall ticked differently, the ticking a little slower than it should have been. The sounds in the house, usually familiar, now seemed distant, like they were coming from somewhere else. She took a step back, unsure of what to do. Was she still in the same world? Was she dreaming? Or had she somehow crossed into a different version of her own reality? The question swirled in her mind, growing more frantic with each passing moment. The man she had seen on the street just yesterday, was he the same? The neighbors across the way, were they the same? She suddenly felt as though she didn't know anything anymore, as though everything was slipping through her fingers, too subtle to grasp, too strange to hold on to. She quickly grabbed her phone, desperate to find something that could reassure her. But when she checked the time, her stomach dropped. It was the same time as always, 7:45 a.m., but the moment she looked at the date, it didn't match what she remembered. Today's date was different. It was one day later than she had thought, one day ahead of what it should have been. It was as if the world had simply shifted, without her even realizing it. She walked back toward the counter, feeling a strange dizziness take over her. Her eyes darted to the small details around her. The cereal box, the teapot, the picture on the wall. All of them were slightly different. The shapes, the colors, even the way the light reflected off the surfaces seemed out of place. It was as though she had slipped into an alternate version of her morning, one where everything looked familiar, but everything was just a little bit wrong. Had I been asleep? Had I somehow woken up in a different world entirely? The thought was too much for her to process. She tried to focus on the here and now, to ground herself in the reality she knew. But each time she tried, the feeling only grew stronger. The feeling that she was not in her world, that something had shifted, and she had crossed into a parallel reality by mistake. Her thoughts spiraled, but in the midst of the confusion, something occurred to her. If this is a parallel universe, then nothing here is truly mine. Nothing is where it's supposed to be. A shiver ran down her spine, and she felt a pang of loneliness. Everything had changed, and yet it hadn't. It was as if the universe had rerouted her morning, giving her an alternate version, one where the smallest of details had been altered. She slowly made her way to the door, her heart still racing. She needed to step outside, to feel the ground beneath her feet, to ground herself in something real. As she stepped into the cool morning air, she glanced around, looking for something familiar, something that would tell her she was still in her world. But the trees, the houses, the road, everything looked the same, yet felt entirely foreign. And in that moment, she realized she may never truly know if she had slipped into a parallel dream, or if she was still trapped in a world where the lines between reality and illusion were blurring. As she walked down the street, the thought lingered in the back of her mind. Had she really woken up at all? Or had she simply slipped into another version of her life? Story 6. The Echo of Time. It was a crisp evening, the kind where the air felt fresh and the sky, painted with hues of purple and orange, was just beginning to darken. The man had been walking for a while, lost in thought, the quiet hum of the city fading in the distance. His mind had been preoccupied with the usual daily matters, but tonight there was something different in the air, a strange feeling he couldn't quite place. It was as if the world around him had slowed down, as though the passing of time had become more noticeable. He had always enjoyed evening walks, the solitude giving him the space to reflect, to let his thoughts wander freely. As he walked down a narrow street, he noticed something peculiar. There, just ahead, was a small, old bookstore. He had passed it many times before, but tonight, something was different. The store, which had been closed for years, its windows covered in dust and the sign hanging loosely on its door, now had a soft light glowing from within. The door, which had once been firmly shut, was slightly ajar. Curiosity stirred within him. He had no real reason to go in, other than the inexplicable pull of the place. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what had brought him here, but the allure of the bookstore was too strong. He stepped forward, the creaking of the door breaking the silence of the street. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. The bookstore seemed abandoned, but the warmth of the light inside suggested otherwise. He was unsure whether anyone was there, or if it was merely the atmosphere that made it feel like a place caught between time. As he entered, his eyes took in the sight of shelves stacked high with dusty books, their spines faded and worn from years of neglect. It was exactly what he had expected, a place frozen in time. But something about this bookstore felt different, almost alive, as though it held something beyond mere stories on the pages. As his eyes scanned the room, something caught his attention. In the center of the room, on a wooden table surrounded by dim light, sat a thick book, one that seemed out of place amidst the others. The book was unlike anything he had ever seen before. There was no title on the spine, no markings of any kind. It was thick, its pages yellowed and weathered. There was an aura of mystery about it that made him pause for a moment before he reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed against the cover, he felt a strange warmth surge through him, almost as if the book were alive, calling to him. With a sense of unease mixed with fascination, he opened the book. As his eyes fell upon the first page, he gasped. The words were written in neat, flowing script, each sentence perfectly composed. But what struck him was not the writing itself, but what it contained. The book seemed to begin telling the story of his life, starting with his earliest memories. It detailed his childhood, the neighborhood where he grew up, the people he had known, the simple moments that made up the fabric of his early years. His heart skipped a beat as he read about events he had almost forgotten. His first day of school, the time he had gotten lost in the park, the friends he had made and lost. The details were astonishing, as though the book knew everything about him, even the things he hadn't thought about in years. He turned the pages slowly, and the book continued to recount his life with eerie precision. The teenage years, the awkward moments, the people who had come and gone, the dreams he had once held onto so tightly. Each page was filled with memories that were so vividly described. It was as if he was reliving them. There was no skipping, no missing moments. Everything, from the small and mundane to the significant events, was detailed with unsettling accuracy. But as he turned the pages, a sense of unease began to creep into his chest. The further he went, the more it felt like the book was not just recounting his life, it was guiding him through it. He felt a strange connection to the words, as if the book knew him better than he knew himself. Then, as he reached the middle of the book, something shifted. The pages stopped. He flipped to the next page, but there was nothing, just an empty space. He turned it again, and again. The pages were blank after that point, as if time itself had come to a halt. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized what had happened. The book had reached the present moment. It had described his life up until that very second, but it could go no further. It was as though time had stopped for him, as if the book had captured his life in a snapshot, frozen in time. He stared at the blank pages, trying to make sense of what he was holding. It was as if the future hadn't been written yet, or perhaps, as if it had already been determined and was beyond his reach. The more he thought about it, the more he began to feel a strange sense of dread. The book wasn't predicting his future. It was simply stating that it had already happened, as if everything had already been laid out in advance, like a story already told. The book wasn't just an observer of his life. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that had always been. Suddenly, the air in the bookstore seemed heavier, and the dim light flickered. The shelves around him felt as though they were closing in, as if the very space had become too small to contain the weight of what he had just discovered. He closed the book slowly, his hands trembling, and for a moment just stood there in the dim light, unsure of what to do next. Was it real? Had he just read his own life, every moment of it? Had time itself somehow folded, creating a moment where the past, present, and future collided? The thoughts circled in his mind like a whirlpool, pulling him deeper into confusion and uncertainty. The book was now closed, but its presence lingered, its words imprinted in his mind. How could he move forward knowing that everything he had experienced had already been written down, that the future was somehow already known, yet still unreachable? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and looked around the bookstore once more. But when he turned to leave, the door that had been open when he entered was now shut tight. The light flickered one last time, casting long shadows across the room. He felt as though he had crossed some invisible boundary, stepping into a realm where time itself no longer followed the rules he knew. The strange book and its reflection of his life stayed with him long after he left the bookstore. As he walked back into the world outside, everything felt both familiar and foreign, as though he was still walking through the pages of his own story, but no longer sure if he was the one holding the pen. And as he lay down to sleep that night, the words of the book echoed in his mind, a reminder that sometimes time isn't just a linear progression. Sometimes it is a reflection of something far more profound, a mirror of everything that was, is, and will be. Story 7. The Instant Replay. It was a crisp, quiet afternoon when the man decided to take a walk. The kind of day where the air felt fresh against his skin, and the world around him seemed to slow down, as though everything was taking a collective breath. He had no particular destination in mind, just a simple stroll to clear his head and enjoy the calmness of the afternoon. The streets were relatively empty, the usual hustle and bustle of the city muted by the time of day. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched lazily along the pavement. As he walked along, his thoughts wandered from one trivial thing to another: a conversation with a friend, the book he had just finished reading, the cup of coffee waiting for him back home. Everything felt normal. Nothing was out of the ordinary. But then, as he turned a corner onto a street he didn't frequent often, something strange caught his attention. A car came speeding by, its engine roaring as it cut through the quiet street. It wasn't anything remarkable in itself. The city was filled with traffic, and cars often sped down these streets, the noise almost becoming a part of the background. But something about this particular car seemed different. As the man glanced at it, he felt a strange sensation. Something was off. It was the kind of feeling that made him stop and watch, even though there was no apparent reason to. The car was an older model, perhaps a little run down, but its headlights blazed bright against the dull afternoon light. As it passed by, he watched the blur of its body, the fleeting details of the driver, and the hurried motion of its tires against the pavement. The sound of the engine was the only thing that remained in his ears as the car raced past. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, before continuing his walk. But as he took a few more steps, something strange happened. He stopped mid-stride and turned back to look at the same street corner. And there, speeding by once again, was the exact same car. The same make, the same model, the same headlights burning through the dimming light. It was moving at the same speed, in the exact same spot, as though the moment had replayed itself. He blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Hadn't I just seen that car? He thought. He was certain that he had. But there it was, as if nothing had happened at all. The sensation that something wasn't right settled deeper into his chest. Was he imagining things? Had his mind simply tricked him into thinking he had seen it already? He shook his head and kept walking, telling himself it was just a momentary lapse in perception. After all, it wasn't an unusual thing to see a car speed by. Certainly not something that should cause him to question reality. But as he walked further down the street, something even stranger happened. Again, he reached the same corner, and once more, the car came speeding by, exactly the same as the last two times. The same model, the same engine roar, the same headlights cutting through the fading sunlight. It was as though time itself had reset and replayed that moment over and over again, like a loop that couldn't be broken. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. This is impossible, he thought. I've seen this before. The car was moving in the same way, down the same stretch of road, at the exact same moment. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, unable to move, watching the same car speed by over and over again. The sound of its engine became a distorted, echoing hum in his ears. His body felt frozen in place, as if he were caught in a trance, unable to escape the loop. It wasn't just the car anymore. It was everything. The street corner, the pavement beneath his feet, the air around him. It all seemed to be shifting, bending, as though it too was caught in a repeating cycle that couldn't be broken. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned and began to walk in the opposite direction. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but the further he walked, the more the feeling of the loop seemed to fade. The car was no longer speeding by. The world around him felt normal again, like he had stepped back into a moment where time flowed as it should. But even then, a lingering question remained. Had he really escaped the loop? Or was he simply walking into another moment that had already been replayed, a part of the cycle he had yet to see. The thought stayed with him as he continued his walk. Could it be that he had slipped into some parallel reality, where time could bend and loop without warning? Could the world he knew simply be a fraud, hiding the true nature of reality beneath its surface? As he lay down to sleep that night, the sound of the car's engine still echoed in his mind, the memory of the endless loop haunting him. And though he closed his eyes, he couldn't help but wonder, was it just a dream? Or had he really experienced time being rewound, playing the same moment again and again?